Prepare yourselves, because the story you are about to hear is not just about history. It is the origin story of civilization itself, a tale so monumental, so impossibly dramatic, that it sounds like a myth whispered by the gods themselves. Can you believe there was a time, long before the pharaohs built their towering monuments and thousands of years before Rome was even a dream in a shepherd's mind, when humanity fundamentally cracked the code of existence? When the concept of the city, of the kingdom, of measured time, of writing, and even the very idea of law was invented out of thin, hot desert air? This is not merely the oldest story, it is the blueprint for everything that followed. A civilization built on mud bricks and ambition that rose higher than any mountain, only to eventually fade into a terrifying, millennia-long sleep. This is the saga of Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, where destiny was first written down, and where the first catastrophe no one saw coming slowly strangled the world's first empire. Imagine the scene. 6,000 years ago, the vast, shimmering floodplains between the mighty Tigris and Euphrates rivers were nothing but brutal, untamed wilderness, a place where survival was a daily, visceral fight against the elements, against the floods, against the endless, hungry sun. Yet, in this crucible of hardship, a group of people whom we call the Sumerians looked at the mud beneath their feet and saw not just dirt, but the potential for paradise. They looked at the chaotic rivers and saw not just destruction, but a system that could be mastered, harnessed, and turned into the lifeblood of an impossible future. They were the ultimate engineers, the grand architects of human destiny, taking the raw materials of the swamp and transforming them, in an intellectual explosion unmatched in human history, into the pillars of the modern world. They didn't just build villages, they built Uruk, the first true metropolis the world had ever known, a sprawling, monumental city of 80,000 souls, surrounded by ramparts visible for miles across the flat horizon. This wasn't just a gathering of huts. This was a political, economic, and spiritual machine of terrifying complexity, a place where life was governed by complex trade routes, monumental architecture, and the very first attempts at formalized religion that defined the relationship between man and the cosmos. The sheer audacious nerve of it! They invented writing, not as poetry, but as a practical tool for keeping track of grain and sheep, pressing wedges into wet clay to create cuneiform, forever trapping spoken language into tangible, eternal form. This single invention allowed knowledge to transcend the fleeting lifespan of memory, enabling the creation of libraries, histories, and ultimately a system of governance that could coordinate the efforts of hundreds of thousands of people across vast distances. They invented mathematics, not just for counting, but for building, for surveying land after the devastating annual floods, and most crucially, they invented time itself, giving us the 60-second minute and the 360-degree circle that still dictates every second of our modern lives. They looked up at the stars, cataloged the heavens, identified the movements of the planets, and assigned them powerful deities, fusing science and spirituality into a cohesive, unstoppable force that drove their civilization forward with dizzying speed. They stood at the absolute zenith of human capability, The inventors of the wheel, the plow, standardized weights and measures, monumental temple architecture, and perhaps most importantly, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving narrative, a dark, primal meditation on power, friendship, and the crushing inevitability of death. But here is where the history turns dark, where the shadow of the desert began to creep back into the magnificent temples built of baked earth. For all their genius, for all their technological mastery, the Sumerians and the empires that followed them, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, were perpetually locked in a brutal cycle of creation and self-destruction, a relentless, violent dance for control of the life-giving rivers. Their story is a constant struggle against the environment they had mastered, against the powerful, hungry neighbors they had inspired, and ultimately against the internal rot that comes when power becomes too absolute and ambition too vast. And the most terrifying part of this entire saga? The moment they finally fell silent. Imagine an entire civilization, the engine room of history, suddenly going quiet. Its monumental cities buried under the sand, its language forgotten, its gods ignored, until the entire memory of their existence was wiped clean from the slate of human consciousness for thousands of years. This wasn't a quick, fiery death like Pompeii. It was a slow, agonizing transformation, a deliberate, quiet surrender to the elements and to the sheer weight of time itself. They didn't vanish, they simply fell asleep, becoming the foundation upon which every subsequent empire unknowingly stood, waiting in the dust for archaeologists to finally pull back the curtain and reveal the true extent of the world's first, and perhaps greatest drama. We are going back to the moment the first mud brick was laid, charting the rise of the god-kings, the brutal, world-shaking battles, the incredible leaps in science, and the final, haunting stillness of the oldest civilization to ever fall asleep. The sands swallowed them whole. Silence fell, a silence so profound it seemed impossible that the very concept of noise, of structured human communication, had been forged right here, under the unforgiving sun. How do you erase the founders of civilization? How do you bury the ledger that tracks the first time a human being measured a second, calculated an orbit, or dared to write down a myth? The sheer hubris of time to attempt such a feat is staggering. This was not a garden paradise. This was a hostile, unpredictable wetland, a place of devastating floods and scorching droughts, hemmed in by the roaring, capricious rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. To survive here was not merely living. It was a defiant, terrifying act of engineering against nature itself, a continuous battle fought with basic tools and sheer, unyielding will. They looked at the chaotic waterways rushing down from the distant mountains and saw not danger, but the raw, untamed potential for absolute control. They didn't pray for the water to stop destroying their lives. They demanded control over the water's fury. The birth of the canal, a straight, audacious line cut into the wild chaos of the marsh, was the first stroke of genius that defined their destiny. These were not simple ditches. They were massive, interconnected public works, demanding coordinated labor on a terrifying scale never before imagined by mankind. Suddenly, the land yielded unimaginable surplus, a wealth of grain and dates that had never existed before. The necessity of shared, organized labor, of managing the harvest and the water flow, birthed the hierarchy, the manager, the record keeper, the priest-king, and the terrifying, inevitable stratification of society. From the simple, humble mud rose the first true urban centers, the cradle of humanity's ambition, Eridu, then and the monstrous, sprawling metropolis of Uruk, walls stretching for miles, built entirely of baked clay and the distilled essence of human ingenuity. When the harvest became too large to remember, when the flocks stretched past the horizon and the temples controlled too many jars of oil, memory failed, and that catastrophic failure gave rise to the single most powerful technology in human history: writing. It wasn't born from poetry or love letters, as later decadent empires might use it. It was born from the brutal, unromantic necessity of accounting and taxation. They started with pictograms, crude symbols pressed into soft, damp clay tablets. A wedge for an ox, a circle for a jar, a wave for water. But necessity sharpened the tool, and those simple pictures evolved into the abstract, lightning-fast geometry of cuneiform. Suddenly, fleeting thoughts, spoken words, laws, treaties, and the very concept of history itself were pulled from the ether and immortalized in the physical world. The world would never be illiterate again, and it was entirely their doing. They didn't just write, they calculated the precise movements of the universe. They gifted humanity the sexagesimal system, base 60, the very mathematical skeleton that defines your clock face right now, the structure of time itself. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. They looked at the stars, not just to navigate the desert, but to predict the capricious moods of their rivers, binding sophisticated astronomy directly to the mundane necessities of agriculture. And then, the wheel. A concept so fundamental, so universally applied, yet it had to be invented. Not for transport initially, but for pottery, spinning the clay into standardized, perfect forms, creating the uniformity needed for their vast, complex logistical society. The idea of rotational mechanics, perfected in that dusty, sweltering workshop, eventually led to the chariots that would dominate the terrible, desperate battlefields they would soon be forced to conquer and defend. This civilization, built on the humble brick and the abstract idea of order, became terrifyingly, magnificently wealthy. Their temples, called Ziggurats, were not merely buildings. They were man-made mountains, stepped towers reaching for the gods, symbolizing the absolute, unchallenged power of the priestly class who controlled the labor, the land, and the very flow of life-giving water. They traded far and wide across the known world, importing precious timber from the distant forests of Lebanon, silver from the mines of Anatolia, and dazzling deep blue lapis lazuli from the distant mountains of Afghanistan. They developed complex contracts, early forms of banking systems, and codified laws. Centuries before Hammurabi would etch his famous decree on basalt, the foundational concepts of justice, debt, and retribution were already being hammered out in the Sumerian courts. They had created the blueprint for everything that followed: bureaucracy, organized religion, the army, the city, and the law. They were the original architects of the human experiment, and they watched their creation flourish, intoxicated by their own power. But immense light casts an equally immense, devouring shadow. The very richness and organization that made them immortal targets also made them a beacon in a savage, fragmented world. The surrounding nomadic tribes, gazing upon the walled splendors of Uruk and saw not genius or hard work, but a feast waiting to be plundered. They saw the golden vessels, the packed storehouses, and the fertile fields, and their envy became a cold, sharpened weapon. The clock had started ticking the moment the first mud brick was carefully laid. They had engineered their own paradise, and by doing so, they had engineered the ultimate target. The desperate gods of the wild, the starving tribes outside the walls, and the ever-present threat of internal decay were all watching, waiting for the first sign of internal weakness, for the exact, terrible moment the oldest civilization would falter and begin its slow, irreversible descent into the long, deep sleep. The world held its breath, waiting for the stumble, but before the descent could truly begin, this civilization decided to perform one last blinding act of defiance against the void. They invented history itself. They didn't just speak their desires to the wind anymore, they carved them, pressed them, and recorded them in the very mud they rose from, creating the miracle known as cuneiform. This was the moment humanity stopped living purely in the present and began tracking its slow, inevitable march toward oblivion. Every wedge-shaped mark on a soft clay tablet was a scream of ambition, a trade receipt, a prayer, a king's boast, 1,000 voices frozen in time, documenting the civilization that knew it was great, perhaps too great to last. They were creating the first archives, the first libraries, stacking the evidence of their own existence higher and higher, almost daring time and sand to swallow it all. They believed if they wrote it down it would be immortal, unaware that the very act of record-keeping would later become the archaeological proof of their tragic silence. But their genius was not confined to pictures and words. It was defined by terrifying precision. They looked at the stars, they looked at the flooded rivers, and they created a mathematical system so foundational, so perfect, that you and I, right now, are living inside of it. We are talking about the sexagesimal system, 360 degrees in a circle, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. This ancient people, rising from the reed beds of the twin rivers, literally invented the clock by which the entire modern world keeps time. This level of organization allowed them to build on a scale previously unimaginable. Uruk, the undisputed crown jewel, rose from the dust, a metropolis of 80,000 souls, protected by massive walls, a shimmering beacon of organized life that drew the envious eyes of every desperate nomad for 1,000 miles. The Ziggurats defined the skyline, not just temples to the moon god Nana or the sky god Anu, but massive mud brick mountains that served as the centralized nerve center, the treasury, the granary, the bureaucratic heart where the scribes held the true power, regulating everything from the price of barley to the exact trajectory of the moon. Yet, this spectacular success housed a fatal, microscopic flaw, one that would guarantee the eventual long sleep, division. They were not a unified empire. They were a collection of fiercely proud, ruthlessly competitive city-states. Hated Lagash. Lagash distrusted Umma. Uruk was constantly maneuvering against Kish. They were magnificent siblings, armed with the same knowledge, fueled by the same river water, but locked in an eternal, petty squabble over irrigation rights, border markers, and access to vital trade routes for lapis lazuli and copper. While their vast collective genius was busy inventing mathematics and astronomy, their political structure was busy perfecting infighting. This constant internal friction was the slow-motion civil war, the self-inflicted wound that would never quite heal, draining vital energy that should have been spent consolidating power against the shadows gathering beyond the fertile valley. The power structure began to shift violently. Initially, the highest authority rested with the Ensi, the priest-king, the chosen intermediary between the city and its patron deity. But as the external threats intensified, as the raids from the Zagros Mountains grew bolder, the need for a different kind of leader became screamingly clear. The Lugal, the great man, the warrior king, the one who ruled by the sword, not the prayer, began to rise in prominence. The struggle for authority between the temple and the military was brutal, played out not with armies in the field, but with cunning and poison in the sun-baked courts. This internal fracture meant that when a true, existential threat finally arrived, there was no single, unified command structure ready to meet it. Instead, each city-state would try to save its own skin, hoarding its soldiers and its grain, ensuring that they would all fall, one by glorious, individualized one. To try and impose order on this glorious chaos, they invented one of their last great structural achievements, the codified law. Not the informal customs of the elders, but bronze-clad decrees written in stone, defining exactly what happens when you steal an ox or injure a noble. This was not a system born of confidence, but of sheer, desperate necessity, a last-ditch attempt to solidify a crumbling social contract before the structure dissolved into anarchy. The famous principle of lex talionis, the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye, was a harsh reflection of a society terrified of its own internal instability, trying to maintain order through sheer, terrifying severity. Yet, even as they wrote down the laws that would govern future empires for millennia, the great clock they had created, ticking in increments of 60, was running out. The internal cracks were too wide, the wealth too tempting, and the eyes watching from the dry hills, the Akkadians, the Amorites, the Elamites, were no longer just envious. They were hungry. The grand, magnificent prelude to the long, deep sleep was over. The stage was set, the blueprints for the modern world were drawn, and the great silence was about to descend. The grand, magnificent prelude to the long, deep sleep was over. The stage was set, the blueprints for the modern world were drawn, and the great silence was about to descend. The ultimate tragedy of this civilization was that the very energy driving its explosive innovation, the fierce, unyielding competition between its independent city-states, was also the blade that would eventually sever its own throat. Think of it. Uruk, the colossal mother city. The harbor of the moon god Nana. Lagash, brutal and brilliant. Each of these centers was a tiny, self-contained universe, a superpower in miniature, and they were obsessed with domination. They looked across the fertile fields at their neighbors not as partners in progress, but as rivals for every precious inch of irrigable soil and every drop of the Euphrates bounty. They had invented the wheel to transport goods faster, but they quickly weaponized it, attaching it to war carts designed to shatter the infantry lines of the adjacent state. They developed writing not just for epic poetry, but for meticulously tallying the spoils of war and inscribing curses upon conquered rulers. While the great Sumerian city-states were busy exhausting their resources and spilling the blood of their own people in these internecine wars, a shadow was lengthening from the northern dust plains, a new and profoundly different entity, tougher, hungrier, and utterly without respect for the ancient traditions of the southern river valley. These were the Akkadians, Semitic speakers who had been quietly absorbing Sumerian knowledge, language, and administration techniques for generations, all while maintaining their distinct rugged identity. They watched the jewel cities of the south bleed themselves dry, waiting for the perfect, catastrophic moment to strike at the cradle of civilization itself. And then, from the absolute obscurity of the palace kitchens of Kish, a figure emerged, a man of impossible origin, shrouded in myth, named Sharakin, or Sargon, the legitimate king. The very name was a magnificent lie, a declaration of pure, unadulterated audacity designed to seize power he had no right to claim. Legend tells us he was born to a high priestess and secretly placed in a reed basket coated with bitumen and set adrift on the river, rescued by a humble gardener who raised him. This origin story, strikingly similar to later biblical narratives, was potent propaganda, establishing him as a man touched by fate, immune to the established order. He rose through the ranks, not as a hereditary noble or a warrior prince, but as the cupbearer to the king of Kish, a servant who listened, watched, and learned every fatal weakness of the ruling class. But Sargon was not content to merely serve wine. He was the thunderbolt of history, the man who looked at the fragmented, warring Sumerian world and decided it was time for true, ruthless, overwhelming unity. Sargon didn't want a city-state. He wanted the entire world, or at least the largest, most powerful contiguous territory the world had ever known. He struck first at Kish, seizing the throne that was not his by birthright, then turned his gaze south toward the ancient, glittering jewels of Sumer, the inventors of his own kingdom's power. His army was a terrifying new machine, disciplined, fanatical, and loyal to him personally, not to the distant, often conflicting deities of some ancient city. He coordinated his attacks with speed and strategy previously unknown in the region. One by one, the great high walls of Uruk and crumbled beneath the force of his relentless, organized assault. The independent Sumerian kings, paralyzed by their own petty grievances and centuries of rivalry, were completely unable to form a unified front against this devastating new vision of imperial warfare. The defeat was total. This wasn't just a military victory. This was the political extinction of the Sumerian ideal of the autonomous, divinely ruled city. Sargon didn't just conquer, he dismantled the entire millennia-old structure, establishing the Akkadian Empire, the world's very first true, vast, multi-ethnic domain, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Suddenly, the inventors of civilization became its subordinates. The ancient Sumerian language, the vehicle of their groundbreaking thought, retreated dramatically from the marketplace and the governmental decree, becoming instead the specialized language of scholarship, ritual, and bureaucracy, a dead language, kept alive only by scribes desperate to hold on to the old ways. The mud-brick temples still stood, the Ziggurats still pierced the sky, but the Sumerian soul, the fierce, independent spirit that had birthed all modern thought, was now trapped beneath the enormous, crushing weight of a non-Sumerian imperial ambition. The long, magnificent sleep had begun, a transition so profound that even their most sacred gods were renamed and absorbed into the new Akkadian pantheon. The stage lights dimmed, not because the actors vanished, but because they were forced to speak a new script written by a conquering director. SUMER was no longer the lead role in the play of history. It was a deeply influential, yet politically mute, supporting pillar in the structure of the Akkadian Empire, waiting silently for its next, brief resurgence before the final, permanent burial under the sands of time. This was the price of invention without unity, absorption. The people who gave the world writing, law, and mathematics were now destined to be remembered only through the records of their conquerors, a tragic paradox etched forever in clay tablets. Their power was gone, but their legacy was now irreversibly woven into the fabric of the entire, expanding, ancient world. They thought the battle was over. They believed that when the last mud-brick tower fell and the royal standard was dragged through the dust, the story of this ancient people was finished. Oh, how tragically wrong they were. The invaders, basking in the glow of their Pyrrhic victory, had captured the body, but the soul, the operating system of civilization itself, had already escaped the cage, soaring on the winds of innovation toward every corner of the known world. The conquerors didn't erase them, they simply inherited the keys to a vast, invisible empire, one ruled not by kings, but by clay and calculation. It was a chilling paradox of conquest. The sheer usefulness of the vanquished culture was its ultimate form of defense. The incoming regimes, whether the Akkadians under Sargon or the subsequent waves of Elamite and Amorite forces, realized immediately that dismantling the infrastructure they had just inherited would be a suicidal act of economic sabotage. They had crushed the government, yes, but they desperately needed the accountants, the scribes, and the engineers to keep the lights on and the grain flowing. The conquest was not an abolition. It was merely a brutal, high-stakes management takeover, and the management manuals were all written in cuneiform, detailing systems that were already millennia old and utterly perfected. The sheer genius of the foundational structure refused to be discarded. Consider the cuneiform script itself. This wasn't just a simple alphabet. It was the most robust, viral technology of communication the ancient world had ever seen. It was so elegant in its ability to handle complex logistics, so universally adaptable across different languages, that even the barbarians who slaughtered their priests and burned their libraries found themselves utterly dependent on it for survival. How do you manage a sprawling, newly annexed territory? You need records. How do you tax the massive harvests gathered along the twin rivers? You need precise accounting. The invading forces, whether they spoke the rough, guttural dialects of the mountains or the nascent, militaristic language of Akkad, quickly realized the frightening truth. If you wanted to rule this land effectively, you had to learn to write like the conquered. Cuneiform rapidly transformed from the language of Sumerian high culture into the lingua franca of diplomacy and trade for the entire ancient Near East. Royal archives found thousands of miles away, from Hattusa in Anatolia to Amarna in Egypt, were filled not with the local tongue, but with Babylonian Akkadian written in the script invented centuries prior in the dusty cities of Uruk and Lagash. The language of defeat became the language of empire. ensuring that the logic, the myths, and the worldview of the vanished people were continually copied, transmitted, and absorbed by every rising power that followed. They were gone, but their documents were everywhere, immortalizing their thought process in every chancellery of the civilized world. And the numbers. This is where the true terror of their genius resided, locking the world into a pattern that endures to this very second. They didn't just count, they structured the very fabric of time and space. The conquerors could change the laws, they could rewrite the history books, but they could not, dare not, dismantle the mathematical framework that held society together, the formidable base 60 system. This sexagesimal system, a system based on 60, perfect for division, became the invisible foundation of modern time and geometry. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These weren't arbitrary choices. They were sacred, perfect divisions derived by astronomers gazing up at the celestial clockwork, defining the rhythm of the entire universe. This single, invisible inheritance meant that every treaty signed, every boundary measured, every astrological prediction made by the new regimes was done using the hidden language of the vanished architects. They were the ghost in the machine, controlling the tempo of the entire ancient Near East from beyond the grave of their political state, forcing every successor civilization to adhere to their numerical blueprint. Now, let's talk about pure hardware, the foundational tech that made war, trade, and ultimately lasting infrastructure possible. The wheel, refined and perfected, was no longer merely a primitive device. It was the engine of global expansion. The chariots that shattered the remaining Sumerian defenses were built using the exact specifications drawn up millennia earlier in the dusty workshops of Uruk. The massive irrigation systems, those complex, life-giving canals that turned arid desert into the most powerful breadbasket the world had ever known, they weren't abandoned. They were seized, leveraged, and expanded by the new masters. Why? Because you don't destroy the engine of prosperity, you just change the driver, ensuring the system remains utterly dependent on the technological breakthroughs of the people they had just slaughtered. And the law. The iron fist of codified justice. While the brutal code of Hammurabi often gets the spotlight, a detailed manifesto of eye for an eye retribution, it was merely a highly successful later-stage revision. The true, terrifying genesis of written, standardized law came straight out of the Sumerian heartland centuries before, establishing the concept that justice must be predictable, public, and permanent. This was pure, revolutionary statecraft. If the people knew the rules written on clay, they were easier to control, easier to tax, and easier to keep in line. The subsequent empires understood this instinctively. They didn't have to invent order, they just copied the Sumerian template, customizing the severity but preserving the revolutionary, civilization-defining concept that law, once written on clay, becomes immortal and transcends the fleeting power of any single king, guaranteeing societal structure. The true, agonizing tragedy of this civilization is not that they were defeated, but that they were too successful. Their inventions were so robust, so essential, that the succeeding cultures had no choice but to adopt them entirely, ensuring their legacy became the bedrock of world history. They became the invisible architecture of every major power that rose in the region: the Babylonians, the Assyrians, Even the later empires of Persia and Greece would ultimately stand on foundations laid by those forgotten people of the mud bricks. They vanished politically, their names absorbed into the sands of time. But their systems, their numbers, their scripts, their wheels, their laws, these became the inescapable chains that bound the rest of humanity into the structure we still recognize today. Their kingdom was dead, but their ghost was now reigning supreme, an echo in every single transaction, every measurement, every tick of the clock. But how long could this ghostly reign last before the sands truly swallowed even the echo itself, plunging their memory into total darkness? The answer lay in the inevitable, creeping silence of the desert. The desert does not rush. It waits. It is a patient, suffocating blanket that settles on the greatest minds the world had ever produced. They were the architects of complexity, the original bureaucrats who understood that chaos was the enemy of eternal progress. How do you run an empire built on canal systems stretching farther than any man could walk in a moon cycle, feeding urban centers of tens of thousands of souls? You invent the ledger. You invent the tax receipt. You invent organization itself, forging the very blueprint for all future government and commerce. The Sumerians realized early that the only way to manage a society so interdependent, where the farmer depended utterly on the canal manager, who depended on the temple scribe, was through brutal, unyielding, and perfect record-keeping. They didn't just count livestock. They quantified the universe. While everyone else was fumbling with awkward bundles of 5s or 10s, these brilliant minds gave us the sacred number 60, the sexagesimal system, which still governs your understanding of time and space today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. 360 degrees in a circle, completing the celestial journey. This was not a random choice. It was the ultimate administrative hack, a number divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. A mathematical perfection that allowed astronomers to map the erratic motions of the stars, engineers to calculate the precise angle of a buttress, and merchants to calculate interest without error, ensuring the delicate, intertwined machinery of their society never seized up. Every modern clock on every wall, every navigational device used by every aircraft owes its foundational structure to the clay tablets baked hard by the Mesopotamian sun thousands of years ago. It is a stunning, terrifying legacy of intellectual dominance that we still cannot escape, a debt rarely acknowledged. But the mathematics were merely the engine. The clay tablet was the fuel. Cuneiform, their distinctive wedge-shaped script, was the world's first true information technology, designed not for poetry or grand pronouncements, but initially for tracking how many jars of barley went to which temple administrator and documenting the precise sale of a field. Imagine a modern civilization where every email, every receipt, every legal contract, every school lesson, every single administrative footnote was carved into stone and clay, destined by its very nature to resist fire and decay and last beyond the limits of flesh and blood. That was their life. They created libraries of administration so vast and detailed that when archaeologists finally dug them up centuries later, they found not just epic poems and royal decrees, but petty lawsuits between neighbors, detailed inventories of household furniture, grade school multiplication assignments, and meticulous records of goat herds moved across the pastures. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of documents, a bureaucratic time capsule so incredibly thick and resistant that it defied the pressure of millennia and the crushing silence of the desert itself. They had built their world to be immortal through paperwork. They had solved the problem of forgetting, or so they desperately hoped. They believed that if they wrote down every single transaction, every law, every boundary marker, that the collective memory of their civilization could never truly be extinguished by time or conquest. It was a defiant, furious act against the crushing oblivion that history promised. And yet, the silence still came. The very weight of their accumulated knowledge, the sheer complexity of their management systems, began to buckle under relentless external pressure and internal strife. The Amorites, the Elamites, the Gutians, waves of aggressive, less administratively burdened peoples, saw not a highly efficient, perfectly regulated city-state, but a wealthy, tempting target ripe for plunder, a jewel box too heavy to carry. The glorious, intricate machine of Sumerian civilization began to slow down, not in a catastrophic explosion, but a grinding, horrifying halt, like dry sand poured directly into the gears of a perfect, finely tuned clock. The final, agonizing phase of their sleep was the cultural absorption, a slow, inevitable osmosis. Their language, the most ancient and complex literary language known to man, began its tragic retreat from the everyday world. It stopped being the vibrant, roaring language of the street, the marketplace, and the battlefield, and became the revered language of the scholar, the high priest, the sacred text, and the dusty academic library. It was preserved, yes, immortalized in the Babylonian and Assyrian schools, taught as a necessary ancestral tongue, but it ceased to live. It no longer birthed new thoughts or new poems, only echoing the old ones. When a language dies, the unique way a people think, the way they structure reality, dies with it, leaving only a shadow. The powerful new empires that came later, Babylon and Assyria, kept cuneiform. They had to. It was the only way to run the inherited infrastructure. But they spoke a different tongue, thought different thoughts, and worshipped slightly different, harsher gods. The foundational civilization became a ghost in its own institutions, a silent, unseen architect whose complex blueprints were still followed, but whose name was rarely spoken with the reverence it deserved. Their magnificent, painstakingly crafted record of existence, designed to defy time, became nothing more than the dusty instruction manual for the empires that superseded them. They did not disappear in fire and blood. They simply became the foundation itself, buried, solid, essential, and tragically forgotten beneath the shifting, unstoppable sands of history, leaving behind only the most beautiful, overwhelming silence. The silence that swallowed them was not the silence of nothingness, but the heavy, suffocating silence of an archive millions of records deep, buried alive under the dust of 4,000 years. They didn't just build cities, they built the first data storage matrix the world had ever known. A sprawling, terrifying system of accounting that made their entire civilization run like a meticulously wound clock until the spring snapped. You have to understand the mind-bending psychological shift that happened when these people, standing knee-deep in the Fertile Crescent, decided that spoken words were too fleeting, too unreliable, and that reality itself needed to be pressed permanently into mud. This was the moment abstract thought became tangible, terrifyingly specific, and legally binding. We are not talking about simple scratch marks. We are talking about cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script that became the undisputed language of power across the entire ancient Near East for millennia, long after the people who invented it were gone. It was their gift, their curse, and the reason we know their deepest, most mundane secrets. Imagine a society where every single grain of barley harvested, every goat traded, every dowry promised, and every insult hurled in the marketplace was immediately converted into symbols on a clay tablet, baked hard, and filed away in endless bureaucratic stacks. They were obsessed with quantification. They measured everything because they believed measurement was control. And who held the keys to this terrifying fortress of facts? The scribe. This was not just a job, it was a priesthood of administration. The scribe was the bottleneck through which all reality flowed, the only person who could translate the chaos of life into the immutable order of the state. They were the ultimate gatekeepers, holding the power of life and death not with a sword, but with a stylus. Their training was brutal. Years spent memorizing thousands of signs, learning the grammar of administration, geometry, and divination. To be a scribe was to be untouchable, elevated above the common laborer whose life they documented, categorized, and taxed. The irony, the devastating historical punchline, is that this very system of meticulous record-keeping, designed to provide stability and immortality, was the mechanism that choked the life out of their dynamism. The administrative state became a monstrous engine that required constant, impossible feeding. As their cities grew, Uruk, Lagash, the sheer volume of tablets created an administrative load so massive it likely required more manpower simply to manage the records than to actually produce the goods being recorded. Imagine trying to run a sprawling empire where every single piece of communication had to be physically molded, inscribed, dried, baked, delivered, and then archived forever in a dark storage room built of the same mud. It was the world's first bureaucratic paralysis, a fatal disease carried by ink and clay. But their greatest invention, birthed from this administrative fever dream, was not just writing, but law. They understood that records meant nothing if they weren't backed by an enforced, systematic framework of justice. Before them, there were only customs and vengeance. After them, there was code. The kings of this civilization didn't just rule, they legislated. They inscribed their laws not just on perishable clay, but on towering diorite stelae, monoliths designed to shout the permanence of their decisions across every city square. This was the birth of the concept that the law applies equally, or at least predictably, to all citizens, regardless of the king's mood on any given Tuesday. We talk about Hammurabi often, but even his famous code stood on the shoulders of forgotten giants like Ur-Nammu, whose laws codified everything from the rights of slaves to fair compensation for injury. This was the revolutionary idea, replacing blood feud with fines, replacing chaos with calculation. They created the framework for modern jurisprudence. The very idea that society can be governed by a written, accessible framework. But here is the terrible truth lurking beneath the majesty of the stelae. The more perfect the law became, the more rigid and brittle the society grew. When you codify every aspect of existence, you leave no room for natural adaptation, no tolerance for the unexpected flood, the shifting river, or the invasion of a decentralized enemy who doesn't care about your beautifully archived tax records. Their precision became their weakness. While they were busy organizing the past and calculating the present, the future was arriving uninvited, smelling of nomadic dust and aggressive ignorance of their sophisticated administrative protocols. They were the masters of organization, but when the chaos finally returned, as it always does, history is a chaotic system. They were too optimized, too perfectly engineered for the stable world they had documented, to survive the unstable world that materialized around them. The final tragic testament to their data obsession is this. When their cities were eventually overwhelmed, sometimes the only thing left behind was the archive itself, thousands upon thousands of baked clay tablets, harder and more enduring than the walls that once protected them, simply awaiting the shovel of an astonished archaeologist millennia later. Their administrative ghosts remain, whispering lists of livestock, sales contracts, and ancient court decisions from the silent depths of the earth, proving that while their people may have vanished, their records, the relentless, unforgiving proof of their existence, were immortal. The stage was set for their slow, agonizing fade, smothered not by war, but by the sheer, crushing weight of their own perfect system. The agonizing fade, the silence that swallows 1,000 years of innovation, did not arrive on the wings of a conquering army. It crept in like a deadly gas, brewed within the very heart of their achievement, the poisonous perfection of the codified world. When you invent everything, the wheel, the script, the law, the calendar, what is left but maintenance? They had solved the puzzle of chaos. The price of that solution was the forfeiture of surprise. Every grain of barley harvested in Lagash, every lamb birthed near every transaction between merchant and farmer was meticulously etched onto clay. Cuneiform, the ultimate tool of liberation, became the chains of absolute accounting. Imagine a civilization drowning in its own paperwork. We are talking about administrative obesity on a scale the world has never witnessed before or since. The state required endless documentation, not because they lacked trust, but because they demanded perfect control over every last resource. The scribal schools, once cradles of genius, transformed into factories churning out human calculators, drones whose entire purpose was to track the movement of state-owned goats. The intellectual muscle began to atrophy. Why innovate a new water wheel when the old one is perfect and documented in triplicates? Why question the stars when the priests have already cataloged their predictable movements for the next millennium? The sheer, crushing weight of tradition became the bedrock upon which their stagnation was built. They worshipped the perfect plans of their ancestors, terrified to scratch a single line into the architectural blueprint they inherited. This was the era of the Ur-3 dynasty, a bureaucratic monolith that demanded absolute, soul-crushing uniformity across the vast alluvial plain. They didn't just enforce laws, They enforced the idea of order until the very air felt too thick to breathe a new idea. The legendary kings, once daring conquerors, became glorified chief executives managing the world's first truly centralized socialist state, where the state owned the means of production and the entire population. And as the internal combustion ceased, the peripheral dangers began to loom large. For centuries, the civilization had considered the people outside the river valleys to be little more than dust and inconvenience. The Gudians, the Amorites, the mountain tribes, they were seen as noisy, illiterate barbarians, incapable of serious threat. But while the people of the great cities were agonizingly measuring the exact tax liability of a fishing net, those barbarians were learning. They were watching the fertile fields, observing the predictable routes of the trade caravans, and most importantly, realizing the profound weakness inherent in rigid structure. A system that relies entirely on centralized control is exquisitely vulnerable to a decapitation strike. If you cut the head off the sprawling bureaucracy, the millions of moving parts freeze instantly. The walls of the city of once impenetrable bastions of mud brick and divine favor, now served less as defenses against invaders and more as boundaries protecting a deeply hypnotized population from the reality outside. The climate, ever the silent executioner, began to shift its allegiance. The intricate, world-defining canal systems, the arteries of their lifeblood, started to suffer from increased salinization. Generations of intensive irrigation without adequate drainage meant that the water table was rising, poisoning the soil with salt, inch by agonizing inch. The yield of the sacred barley, the foundation of their entire economy and diet, began to drop. Not a sudden collapse, which would have sparked revolution, but a subtle, decade-by-decade degradation. It was the statistical proof that their perfect system was eating itself alive. The scribes diligently recorded the falling numbers, meticulously tracking the death of the fields, but offered no new solutions. They only knew how to record the past, not invent the future. The desperation led to a hardening of the system, not a softening. When the fields failed, the bureaucracy clamped down harder, demanding more tribute from less productive land. They became prisoners of their own success, stuck in a feedback loop of diminishing returns and increasing rigidity. The population, once vibrant and fiercely independent city dwellers, were transforming into state serfs, tired, hungry, and deeply discouraged. This wasn't decline. This was calcification. Their genius had turned to stone. The priests and kings started believing their own exaggerated myths, that they were literally chosen by the gods to administer this perfect, unchanging world. Any deviation was heresy. The spirit of innovation, the fire that had dragged them out of the mud, was now a banked ember, buried under mountains of clay tablets and suffocating dogma. And then the sound of movement from the desolate hills. The Amorites, the Westerners, a seemingly endless tide of nomadic tribesmen, were not interested in writing poems or counting sheep. They were interested in the staggering wealth trapped inside the walls of the cities that were too busy arguing over ledger entries to sharpen their spears. The great city of the shining jewel of the plain, was about to face the ultimate test of its perfection. Could a civilization built entirely on perfect record-keeping defend itself against people who kept no records at all? The answer, etched in the dust of their final, catastrophic collapse, was a terrifying whisper across the millennia. The sleeper was stirring, but only in its final, restless dream before eternal silence. The sleeper's final, restless dream was not a nightmare of battle and blood, but a cold, relentless calculation. It was the echo of numbers, the perfect, chilling logic that defined their greatest and ultimately most fragile achievement, the invention of organized thought itself. This civilization didn't just learn to farm. They learned to divide reality, hacking the universe into manageable, predictable units. They stared into the void of chaos and imposed order with a stylus and a wet clay tablet. Every modern second you spend, every minute you wait, every degree you measure on a compass, it is a direct inheritance from the temples of Uruk and Eridu, from the minds obsessed with the seemingly arbitrary perfection of the number 60. It was the sexagesimal system, an intellectual breakthrough so profound it established the framework for time and geometry itself. While the rest of the nascent world struggled with simple tally marks, the sleeper built a mathematical universe designed for complex commerce, sophisticated engineering, and, most importantly, the meticulous mapping of the heavens. They didn't just count sheep. They counted the passage of the cosmos. Every ziggurat, those towering step pyramids of baked brick, was not merely an altar to the gods, but an indispensable astronomical observatory, built higher and higher to reduce the interference of the desert haze. Their priests were the first true scientists, meticulously tracking the wandering lights, the planets, and predicting lunar eclipses with breathtaking accuracy. They codified the constellations, creating the zodiacal system, establishing the inescapable link between celestial alignment and terrestrial fate that still grips humanity thousands of years later. This was not superstition born of ignorance. This was empirical observation layered over millennia, proving that the gods operated on schedule, and therefore man could too. They created star charts that were used by navigators long after their civilization had crumbled into dust, proving the eternal utility of their genius. But this intellectual perfection required a relentless engine to function, the scribe. Below the high temples, in the dusty, labyrinthine administrative buildings, sat the true power of the sleeper, the bureaucracy of the clay tablet. These scribes, the masters of cuneiform, were the backbone of this flawless system. They managed the immense complexity of an irrigated society, recording the precise allocation of grain rations, tracking the movement of copper from distant mines, and cataloging the land ownership disputes between neighboring city-states. Their literacy was not a luxury. It was the mechanism that held the entire colossal experiment together. Tens of thousands of tablets, stacked in clay-lined rooms, formed the first great libraries, the original big data repository of human history. These records were the proof that this civilization valued information above almost all else, viewing knowledge retention as the key to eternal prosperity. They didn't just invent writing to tell epic tales. They invented it to balance the books, to ensure that the water flow was fair and that the rule of law, codified in elaborate pre-Hammurabic legal codes, was absolute. They built a societal machine so finely tuned it should have run forever. Yet the irony is heartbreaking. For all their ability to calculate the future path of Jupiter, they failed to calculate the fate of their own environment. While their astronomers looked up, their farmers failed to look down. Their relentless use of irrigation, the very system that provided their surplus and financed their glorious intellectual expansion, was poisoning them. Water, eternally evaporated in the scorching sun, left behind mineral salts. Year after year, century after century, the fertility of their magnificent fields slowly declined. The earth itself, which they had coaxed into civilization, was turning against them in a silent, slow, and utterly inevitable rebellion. The cuneiform tablets, which once recorded massive barley yields and triumphant conquests, began to whisper of tragedy. Scribes documented the forced shift from high-yield barley to salt-tolerant wheat, a desperate agricultural retreat etched onto the clay. The grand, mathematical predictions of the stars could not stop the creeping salinity, the rising tide of environmental degradation that no military could fight and no god seemed willing to prevent. Their calculations were perfect, but their data, the health of the soil, was fatally flawed. This intellectual insulating layer, the sheer brilliance of their abstract thought, became their weakness. They could solve any equation, but they could not solve the fundamental geopolitical weakness of their location, dependent entirely on the twin rivers and the health of the land they had overexploited. The sleeper, having invented the clock, was now running out of time. The final tablets record not glorious achievements, but the grim movement of people, migration, political fragmentation, and the slow, agonizing realization that their perfect system was dissolving into dust and salt. Their profound legacy was not erased by the sword of a barbarian. It was quietly absorbed by the sand and the silence, leaving the rest of humanity to stumble blindly upon the fragments of their genius, eternally puzzled by the civilization that taught the world how to count, only to lose count of its own days.